Hello, everybody. My name is Jason Grant. This is Integral live stream YouTube about design system from IBM. And today I have an enormous pleasure of having with me Sonefeld, who is one of the masterminds behind the whole thing. So work with people who are the creators of the things that we as designers end up using, and here right from the source of the creation works, why is it important, etc. So Carbon Design System, I came across it a bunch of weeks ago, started using it for a big project, and I quite like it. So I thought, hey, let's reach out to the thing and the person leading the team and see what they have to say about it. And so without further ado, let's hear from Bethany about Carbon Design System. And then once she does a little sort of set presentation, we'll have a bit of a Q&A. I'm going to put myself on mute so there's no background noise from my end. Thank you.
Cool. Thanks, Jason, for that intro. Yeah, like Jason said, my name is Bethany, and I'm from the Carbon Design System at IBM. And today I'm just going to tell you a little bit about the history of Carbon, kind of where we got started, and bring you up to speed on where we are today. So some of you may know that IBM is going through this transformation in terms of design. So about 5 years ago, the company really made a commitment to incorporating design into all of our products and really focusing on this branch called IBM Design. And the mission of that is essentially just creating a sustainable culture of design at IBM. So part of this includes hiring thousands of designers. And this was the group that I was hired in with. Typically, it's around 40 to 70 front-end developers, designers, design researchers. And IBM puts us through a design boot camp. And what that means is essentially we learn how to use design thinking as a framework to design products for enterprise software. So IBM Design Language is our parent brand of Carbon. So we refer to the design language a lot in terms of color and typography and grids and iconography. And it's really something that we use as the foundational elements for building out products. So now I want to get into a little bit of background in terms of the specific product that I work on. So my team works on IBM Cloud, and formerly known as IBM Bluemix. So it's essentially just a platform as a service for mobile and web developers where they can host, scale their applications. There's a catalog of services that they can use, including APIs and things like that. So since I've been at IBM, I've kind of been able to see the evolution of IBM Cloud, and it GA'd in June of 2014. So it's been in existence for about 3 years now, but you can see from this timeline that no design system or no style guide had existed up until 2 years after the product was publicly available. So we began to see a lot of inconsistencies across the product. So here I'm showing the same page for different services. So it's essentially supposed to be the same user experience, but you can see like visually it's a lot different, just the style of it, but also the UX patterns and how someone goes through and uses these pages was super inconsistent across the platform. And this is due to a lot of smaller teams owning this experience. So the challenge for us was creating a design system that was able to speak the language of both designers and developers, but also being able to cater towards, offering management or engineers who may not be familiar with a design background. So this was kind of our guiding principle moving forward, was that we realized that there were hundreds of designers and developers that were contributing and shipping things to IBM Cloud. And we really needed just a single source of truth that housed like our consistency guidelines, visual patterns, a set of code standards, and things like that. So I like to call this next phase sort of our toddler years. We were just beginning to learn to walk and kind of getting our feet up under us and figuring out what we needed to do to build and scale the design system. And something I think is really important is having a dedicated team that's working full-time on a design system. So previous to this, we had people working on a set of components kind of split between like 30% of their time. And we really realized that in order to build something full out, we needed a team working on it full-time. So at the time, we had a team of 10, kind of split almost evenly between designers and developers, which was also very important to us because we wanted designers to pair with our front-end developers to make sure that what we were building was actually up to design spec. So we really kicked it off by just having a design thinking workshop. We did a lot of journey mapping and empathy maps to kind of understand where we currently were in terms of style guides and design systems, and then what our mission and goal would be moving forward. So this is kind of our guiding principle. Our North Star was that an IBM offering team can discover, understand, and use the Bluemix design system to independently build their Bluemix approved experience. And you can see here, at the time, we were called the Bluemix design system because we were so focused on IBM Bluemix as our product. So that was our main sponsor user. And really what we did to get started was we just worked in 2-week sprints, and our main goal was to have a documentation website that housed UX patterns, visual specs, things like that, a stable code base that engineering and development teams could start pulling from, and then a design kit and sketch that we could ship out to our designers. So that was our goal for our MVP. And by sprint 6, so mid-June-ish, we were able to ship our first version of the design kit and our first version of Bluemix components that was stable enough for development teams to use. And then we also had our first version of the website. So this website basically contained a lot of guidelines in terms of color palettes, typography. We also had detailed information about each component, so you could see it live, kind of play with it, be able to copy the code snippet. And we also had visual specs so that you could really dig into each part of the component and learn about different spacing assets, or what the color on the border is and things like that. So very nitty-gritty details that we felt were super important for people to understand. And next, I like to call this phase our teenage years. So we had shipped our MVP, we felt really good about that, and now we were just beginning to mature enough to the point where we were learning from our previous mistakes and trying to improve on those. So just kind of looking at the timeline of Carbon, we had shipped version 6 in June of 2016. So that was technically like our first major release. And then March of this year was version 7.0. And version 7.0 was really focused around 4 key factors. So number 1 was open sourcing the system. That was really important to us because we had third-party services that we needed to cater to them, and we needed them to be able to use the system and not just have it be an internal IBM product. Secondly, we decided to do a huge component refactor. So a lot of the things that we learned along the way between version 6 and 7 was that we wanted to make our code more performant and just improve it as a whole. So that was a big refactor of those things. I guess this whole version was just like a refactoring version. We also refactored our documentation website. We rebuilt it in React. I'll go into a little bit more of those details in a few. And then lastly, I think this was the biggest one, but just rebranding ourselves to Carbon. This was partially due to a lot of teams were interested in using our design system, but they were saying, well, it's named the Bluemix design system, so I can't use it because I work on Watson or something like that. So we really wanted to kind of separate ourselves from a product-specific design system and really focus on just creating a design system that the most amount of teams could get use out of. So the first kind of hurdle we had to get over was open sourcing the system. And I think working at a company that's not necessarily familiar with open sourced technology, that was kind of a challenge for us. A lot of paperwork, and luckily our manager was really good about following up with all of those things. So we were able to get our open source approval in February of 2017, so just a month before we released. So that was really, really exciting for us. And Secondly, our component refactor. So you can see here, we're just kind of cleaning up a lot of our assets. We had a flattened file structure compared to version 6. Before, we had base elements and components, which was more along the lines of atomic design, and we just decided to move towards using just components instead of breaking apart the two. And then you can see here, we just deleted a lot of legacy code that wasn't necessary. Like here in our modal, we deleted 1,000 lines of code. So just really cleaning things up, making our code more performant. And then this is something I think has impacted us the most. So we implemented this new PR process where whenever our developers would refactor a component, we would make sure that 2 designers had signed off on it. So our developers were great at shipping the component to like the staging site so we could view it and kind of play around with it, see how it works, make sure it's up to spec. And this really, really helped us to key in on those details to make the design kit actually reflect what was in the live component. And then third, we rebuilt our entire website. So one of our senior front-end developers, Mari, was the pioneer behind this. She rebuilt the website as a single-page React app, which really helped improve performance on the website. Again, just cleaning up the code helped us to increase maintainability. We wanted to make sure that it was easier for designers to also contribute content, and I think this was something that I was a big fan of. A lot of our designers use GitHub to track issues and things like that, so they're familiar with using Markdown to write content. So we decided, hey, wouldn't it be great if we could just write Markdown and have it be translated into the website? So this way, we're using a Markdown parser called Markdown It. It makes it so designers that aren't necessarily familiar with front-end code, they're able to contribute content regardless of their skill set in development. So that brings us to version 7.0, and this was kind of our redesign of the website as well. So you can see here the difference between 6.0 and 7.0. 6.0 is very Bluemix focused. It pulls from a lot of the color palette that existed in product at the time. And version 7 we felt like was a lot more aligned with the IBM design language in terms of style and color, and we really wanted to focus on creating a design system that fit a wide variety of products. So once we had version 7.0 out, I think moving forward, we were very excited about the different possibilities that we could do to improve, continue to scale it. And I like to call this phase kind of like getting our shit together, because we were really maturing at this point. We were learning from our mistakes, and we were, most importantly, meeting with our sponsor teams to learn about their needs. So I think part of this is also what I like to call maintainability land. And the reality is that the hard part is building a design system. And once you get it out the door, it's all like sunshine and rainbows moving forward. All the hard work's done. And I think in reality, it's really like prepare for battle, right? You're fixing bugs. You're spending a lot of time maintaining the code base, making sure it's consistent and up to spec. You're spending time answering questions from people. And this is all great. Like, don't get me wrong, I think this is also a really exciting part of building a design system, but I just want people to know that there is a lot of work moving forward after you get the initial MVP out the door. So I have a few tips and tricks that we've done to kind of help improve that workflow and improve our maintainability. One thing is a code of conduct. So we have actually three Slack channels that we maintain. And initially we were getting like a lot of @heres or @channels, like people wanting us to answer their questions, which is great. Like, we love the community that we've built. But at the same time, we needed to have some sort of code of conduct that said, you know, hey, here's best practices for communicating with us. If we don't answer your question right away, like, here's next steps you can do and things like that. So this has helped to alleviate some of that pain. Documentation is another huge thing that we've been trying to ramp up on, especially. With version 7.0, we included a lot of FAQs below each component. So this helped to kind of answer questions before they could get to us directly. So it gives a lot of basic information that, you know, could be answered quickly. And we realized that documentation is everything. And we're really making an effort to continue to build up on our documentation so that we're not having people asking the same questions tons of times. I think when we do see that, we realize, okay, this is a problem on our end because people are confused about something, and obviously we need to work on our messaging strategy around that. And also contribution guidelines. So we get people that come in a lot and they're like, I have this component that I built, but I'm not really sure how to get it into Carbon or what your guidelines are or things like that. And I think part of building a community around a design system is really ramping up your contribution model. So we couldn't be where we are today without a lot of the product designers and developers who have helped us to get here. And with these guidelines, I think we're kind of just guinea pigging it right now, where we're still learning about how people want to contribute to the platform. So this is something that we hope will help contributions ramp up in the future. And then recently we started doing these component check-ins, which I think has helped us immensely. We basically meet with our product designers and developers who sit in Austin. We meet with them bi-weekly. And basically it's a share out session where we'll say, hey, Carbon's working on this. This is what's coming in the next few months. And I'd love to see what you're working on. A lot of the times we'll hear the need for a new component in these check-ins. And that's when we'll say, okay, we probably need to prioritize this and put it into our sprint schedule. And then more recently, we've started doing Carbon sessions. And this is really to help us outreach to remote teams who don't sit in Austin, who maybe want some more one-on-one time with the Carbon team. It's a chance for them to ask us questions and also share out what they're working on and things like that. And then lastly, it's funny that I say we're growing old and wise when in reality we've only been a design system for a year and a half, but I think technology moves so fast where I really feel like we're at the point in the design system where we're mature enough, where we're growing and scaling, and we're really outreaching to more and more product teams, which is super exciting. So we're still kind of in maintainability land, but in October of this year, we shipped version 8. And version 8, it was focused around a few different things. So to kind of preempt this, when we first started the design system, we inherited a lot of components from the product at the time, so IBM Bluemix. And you can see here on the right that the components are very specific to that product. And we realized that as teams were starting to adopt Carbon, like Watson, they were saying, well, these cards don't really fit our use case, so we're having to override the code, or we're having to, build our own card because this doesn't work for us. So with version 8, we really wanted to make our core set of components really be generic components that most products could use. So buttons and links and breadcrumbs and things like that that are not so product specific. And then our add-ons are things that are maybe very specific to IBM Bluemix or IBM Watson and things like that. So I think that helped to alleviate a lot of confusion as well, because people were saying, there's this detail page header, I'm not really sure how to use it. And for us, it's like, well, we inherited this from the product, so we don't have complete design control over it, if that makes sense. And then another really exciting thing was IBM Plex. So this is IBM's new typeface and font that Mike Abink in New York designed, and we were very happy to adopt Plex into our components instead of Helvetica. So we made the switch, and you can see sort of the difference here in components. I feel like Plex gives the components a bit more personality, whereas Helvetica, it's used pretty widely across the design community, so I think Plex is definitely our opportunity to set ourselves apart. And just putting our website side by side between version 6, version 7, version 8, you can kind of see how we've progressed throughout the years and through, well, year and a half, and then progressed through the different versions. So I think as a whole, we're learning from a lot of our product teams that we're working with, and we're continually working on making improvements and scaling the system and also maintaining it at the same time. So that's all I have for you today. I think we're gonna open it up to Q&A next.
All right. Thank you very much, Bethany, for that. It's really and a very useful insight, not just into carbon design system, but also the system behind the system that you're creating. Like we're constantly now finding ourselves as designers within this kind of situation where we're using systems to create other systems that are then used to build other systems.
Right.
And it's like a meta thinking scenario. So I think I have a bunch of questions for you that may be quite meta in the nature, but that's what we're here for. So one of the first things that comes to mind is, and I've pondered on this myself as a UX designer and putting these kind of systems into play for agencies and corporate clients in the past years. How do you deal with component variants? So you showed an example of a card component there, and there was a bit of like secondary information on there. So there is a card component, one has secondary information, one doesn't. Is that the same component? Is that a variant? How do you deal with that? And if specifically if it needs to be slightly visually differently treated, how do you think of that? And tell me more about that, please.
Yeah, so that's something that we kind of worked with in our version 6 of Carbon. We had a lot of variations of different components. So cards, for example, I think we had 6 different variations, and they were just slightly different to the point where like it had a button in the footer, or it had a set of icons or something like that. And for us, we realized that not every component needs to be built out with all of these variations. Like it's just not really smart performance-wise to have that many. So we actually worked backwards. So we had a lot of variations starting out, and then we kind of trickled it down and really just built a very strong foundational element. So our cards now, I think we only have 2, and we leave it in the hands of the development teams to kind of build out their own version if they do need one. So for example, if they need like a link in the footer rather than a button, it's not too hard to switch something like that out. In terms of style changes, so we try, if a team has a need and they say these cards aren't working for us, we would like rounded corners or something instead. Typically we don't make like grand scale style changes unless we have like user feedback that says either users were confused by this, or it's not working for them or something like that. Also, if we hear the need from like at least 3 to 4 teams, then we'll kind of come back and say, okay, this is probably something we should prioritize.
Okay, awesome. And so in terms of then making this open source, I ended up in design system because I was looking for something to start off with, creating sort of a design system both for Integral as well as a client. And so tell me a little bit more about how much sort of uptake and impact you've had on non-IBM UX designers and sort of front-end developers so far. How's that relationship been so far?
Yeah, so I think oddly enough, we saw that adoption increased once we went open source. Like it increased within IBM once we went open source, because I think lucky enough for us, some of the design members in the community had noticed Carbon and had done some PR around it. So I think it got some attention, which actually helped us internally. And I think, strangely enough, our engineering teams, that was the biggest hurdle for us to get over. We had to really build a relationship with them and say, this component library will help improve your workflow. I think designers on the team were a little bit harder to get to and increase adoption rates with, and that was expected. I think designers tend to have this personalized feeling towards whatever they build. So for us, it's just having a dialogue to say, what we're building is for you. We want to work with you to build out a new component, and that's typically our workflow. So if we hear the need for a new component, we will typically start ourselves and do a lot of research and build out a set of like 3 concepts, and then we'll bring in those sponsor users product designers and things like that, so that they feel like they're involved in the process rather than us just working in a silo and building something and then saying like, here you go. We really want to bring them in early on and have that discussion with them so they feel a part of the process.
And so what I've noticed over the last 10 years of doing UX design specifically, and I also come personally from full stack development background and front-end development and then UX design and strategy, what I've noticed is that nowadays the value is no longer in designing an individual button or a drop down and so on. Value has gone much higher up the stream into designing full flows as quickly as possible to help the users actually achieve tasks. And nowadays, there's a lot of talk around jobs to be done kind of approaches. What is the user actually trying to achieve? And usually that isn't achievable through a single page interaction. It's a flow of pages. So tell me a little bit more about how quickly are you able to get to designing flows and discussing flows versus just kind of single screen?
Sure. So we actually leave a lot of the macro UX work. So like you're talking about a lot of user flows and things like that. We rely heavily on our product designers who work on IBM Cloud to really hone in on those experiences. So the way the design team works under IBM Cloud, there's different teams ranging from like 5 to 10 designers and developers who work on different experiences within the product. So for example, there's a catalog team, there's the console team who's in charge of a lot of the core platform behaviors. So the Carbon team doesn't necessarily work on the grand scale of user flows, but we do make sure that whatever components we're building can fit those use cases that will work across product. And it's a little bit tricky for IBM Cloud because there's a few different areas of the product that are vastly different. So we have infrastructure, for example, or we have mobile or Watson, and those all differ in terms of experiences. So the challenge for us is building a component that will fit across the product and that's going to work for the most amount of users.
Okay, so I understand in many respects you're like a meta design team. You're giving people a toolkit to design with, and then the other product designers are responsible for building out flows from your essentially atomic design kit with some components as well. So tell me a little bit more about those kind of specific things, because what I've noticed is that where things get really, really tricky is when we get into super interactive widgets and components that have lots and lots of interaction. They're kind of quite live. So how do you deal with that? Or do you leave those to specific teams to come up with those kind of components as a sort of extension of the Carbon design system language, and to kind of try and generalize a set of common super interactive components?
Right. So it depends on the team and the use case. For the most part, it's what you said, is that we try to work with the teams to generalize the components as best as we can. I think something we ran into recently was we were building out this type ahead drop-down component that we were trying to make it work for all of these different use cases. And there's a lot of interactions and a lot of thought process behind what goes in a drop-down. And can you multi-select, or can you batch select actions? And there's just a lot of those very minute and very key details that I think can make or break an experience, whether or not you're thinking about it at a grand scale or at this very small micro scale. So that's really what my team focuses on, is perfecting those really small details to make sure that the product designers aren't having to take the time to think about those things. They're able to think about things at a grand scale. So yes, it's what you said. We definitely work with them and we say, you have this large idea. We'd like to kind of tone it down a little bit and make sure it matches accessibility. It passes all of these globalization and internationalization things. those things that we consider not a lot of product designers need to spend the time worrying about.
Okay. And to what extent then are you, this is one of the other, being a little bit sort of selfish here by asking some of the questions that I'm kind of batting my head against the wall about, but to what extent do you, and why is this not in the carbon design system? The sort of some of the standard, let's say, for example, and this, I'm saying this is standard, but it may not be. For example, there's certain things that seem to be standard, like logging in, registration, or that kind of onboarding, forgotten password screens, that kind of stuff. Why don't you just have like templates for those kind of standard page level templates? Why is that not in the carbon design system?
Sure. So it's actually something we've considered, and we've talked about it a lot recently. One of my visual designers keeps bringing it up to me, actually, and it's something that I think we've heard a need for, but at the same time, we're riding the fine line of where do we get too prescriptive. So in the past, we did actually provide templates for different IBM Cloud experiences, and a lot of the times teams would stray from those templates. I think sometimes we worry about being too prescriptive and saying this is how it should be. So for us, it's kind of, how do we provide guidance for those a little bit grander scale UX patterns without saying this is exactly how it should be. Like there's a lot of different variations you could have with what you were saying, like a password error state. Is the form vertically stacked? Is it horizontally stacked? And yeah, so it's definitely something we've considered. I think that might be like a utilities section or something that is a little bit grander scale of just the base components. So maybe coming soon.
Okay, so yeah, because I'm sort of personally in two minds about this, because on some level I can see it as being kind of, can create best practice templates to work from. They're not necessarily, they're recommended, and the recommendation is something that you can work from and either upgrade or degrade depending on the individual use cases. Whereas a prescription would be like, do this or else we will find you, and not like a kill a pixel on you on purpose. And so then the question is, extent do you believe that there is best practice universal UX design approaches to certain very, very common use cases that have existed, years now, meaning 20 years on the internet, and to what extent can we design, let's say, from those best practices, or do you just still think that that's something that we should leave to individual streams of products and so on?
No, I definitely think it's something that is needed. I think best practices is probably the best sort of language to describe it. Again, for us, the challenge is making sure that it fits into the global product scale that we're working with. And yeah, it's a tricky area. It's something I've kind of dabbled with in the past few months, where we'll hear the need for a greater UX pattern, not too frequently, but oftentimes people will say, I don't really know how to design a sign-up experience, or what does it look like to put in your credit card information or something like that. For us, it's like, do we leave that up to the core console designers to figure out those experiences because they do own the core part of the platform? Or is it up to the Carbon team who builds the design system to kind of create those patterns and best practices? So yeah, it's definitely something we're still trying to figure out, but I definitely think best practices can help improve any designer's workflow.
All right, so there's another question that I have around the psychology of design and designers who are building things and designing things. To what extent do you think that designers to some extent, like suffer from their own point of view on how design should be versus working with universal guidelines that prescribe to them and being free form. So I often talk about there's two types of freedom: freedom outside of the form and freedom inside the form. You're given designers a form to work within. It's a bit like classical music orchestration. It's like you've got a classical orchestra. This is your orchestra. Now write a piece of music for that. If you want an electric guitar, that isn't available to you. So stop thinking about an electric guitar. And designers today still kind of suffering from this sort of need to be free outside of a form versus learning how to be free inside the form. Tell me more about what kind of hiccups or sort of barriers you come across and how you've overcome kind of getting designers to be free inside the form of Carbon design system.
When you say form, do you literally mean like a form element, or are you just talking about the form of a design system?
Form of a design system, so the set of rules look sort of, even like if let's say, even if I'm building, and this is always where it ends up being meta discussion, but even if I'm building a form to fill in details through like an HTML form, there is still kind of do's and don'ts in there in terms of there is, I don't know if you're this, but there is a website called fuckdropdowns.com where a bunch of guys have talked about how drop-downs are an absolute no-no and we should avoid them at every single cost. Having said that, be a thing that's still lingering around. So there's these kind of like subtle guidelines and rules around when to use certain things and when not to use certain things. So for example, if it's typically title, Mr., Mrs., Ms., all that kind of stuff, typically it's treated with a drop down, comes first before name and surname, things like that. And you know, that can be improved on or iterated on. To what extent that designers are still wanting to break those and patterns versus embracing them and actually designing the things that are different and new and valuable?
Sure. So I think for the most part, we've seen most designers be really wanting to adopt the patterns that we've built. More times than less, we have people that ask us about what do we think about so-and-so. And for us, it's like we provide a base set of guidelines, and if they don't work for you, we want to hear about it. Obviously, we're not perfect. The guidelines that we've written aren't perfect, but we're just trying to get a foundational set of elements out there to build from. So a good example of this is something came up recently about like optional versus required fields. And we had a lot of people who felt very passionately about denoting required fields in a form. So whether or not you put like an asterisk there or something. And our guidance says that you should only denote when fields are optional, because typically in a form, you don't want a user to be putting in like data that's not required of them, that's just asking for more of their time. So that was a huge discussion we had, and we didn't have any guidance around that on the site currently. So that was where we realized, okay, we need to be providing some sort of guidance, because this question has come up quite a few times. And in cases like that, I think it's better to provide something rather than nothing. And another example of this is illustration guidelines. So we're working on these right now, actually, and this is something that a lot of visual designers on IBM Cloud have been building illustrations on their own because there was no set of guidelines to pull from. And while I think each designer wants to feel like they've built something on their own and that's very personal, there's also this sense of community when you build something that feels cohesive with the greater experience. So that's something we're working on right now, is to build out a set of just basic illustration guidelines and kind of pilot that with teams that are building out illustrations and see how it works with them.
And so there's some questions coming in from our viewers. So I'm going to rephrase a couple of questions that have come in and sort of try and ask it in one cohesive question. So it's around stakeholder management. And you mentioned a little bit earlier on around promoting carbon design system to IBM, and this kind of open sourcing it had reflective effect on kind of making it more popular inside IBM. But tell me more around sort of how you manage the stakeholders insofar that as carbon design system designers have a stake in product design at large, but then product design individual streams on the product itself. So your stakeholders are potentially everyone inside IBM who is building products, but then the individual product designers have their stakeholders. So how does that stakeholder management process work, and what are the sort of common issues that you found for those?
Right. So I think one of the challenges we run into is a lot of the times we need to align our release schedule with the product's release schedule. So an example of this is the infrastructure team is building out a new feature or experience that lives within the infrastructure part of IBM Cloud. And they say, we have this new component that we have in here, but it's not in Carbon, but we are shipping this in October or something. So we'll have to kind of work with them to realize, so they each have offering management that's in charge of running those experiences. So we need to work with them to say, okay, we will set this deadline for this component so you're able to have it for so-and-so release. And that's definitely not perfect. We haven't gotten that process down yet. I think there's been a lot of hiccups along the way where mostly we just need to get better about communicating about deadlines. I know a few months ago we had like a hot fix we had to do for one of the components because they needed it for an upcoming release. So for us, it's just having a better communication model and saying, where can we build components out that can help you progress and get to the release that you're aiming towards, instead of holding them back and having their development teams have to build something on their own. So again, just being more open about our communication strategy and having that dialogue early on.
All right, and so I think let's start wrapping it up. So I'm going to throw in one sort of little question, and maybe we can have one more and then start wrapping it up. So the curveball question is, carbon design system work inside the new age type interfaces such as chatbots and on typically mobile desktop interactions. What about chatbots? What about that? Do you find it to be breaking at that point, or is it perfectly kind of evolving into that world?
It's definitely challenging. In terms of your question about mobile, that's something we've dabbled with a lot, where people will say, are your components responsive? And it's like, well, what does responsive really mean? Are you building a native app? Are you building a web app? And we've gotten a request a few times for like an iOS flavor of Carbon. And it's like, okay, then we have to take the human interface guidelines built by Apple, and we have to take Carbon, and we have to kind of merge the two design systems. I don't think that the interface guidelines are necessarily a design system, but they are a set of very prescriptive patterns for building apps on iOS. So challenge for us is, how would we build out a Carbon flavor of that and make it feel like IBM Cloud? In terms of chatbots, I think design systems can still help improve any experience in UX, whether or not it's an AI experience or for mobile or tablet, anything that you're doing. I think design systems just really help improve, speed up your workflow, help provide consistency across products and cohesion especially, and really help teams to just align on a common set of values. So yes, I think design systems can work for a wide set of different use cases.
Okay, so another perhaps a little bit controversial question, and just to get a little bit of sort of slightly different slant of discussion. How do you guys think and feel about things like material design and other types of design systems out there, like the Bootstrap and so on? Some of them have been around for like donkey's years, and what's your take on that, and why did you specifically design to do your own internal carbon design system that some people might say, well, it's kind of doing exactly the same thing like these other design systems in many respects? Salesforce have their own one as well. So why would someone use carbon design system versus the Salesforce, I can't remember what the name is, or material design?
Yeah, so I look at those design systems as inspiration. So I think it's great if teams are able to have the resources and the time to dedicate to build out their own design system. I learned so much just in the past year and a half building out the design system. And I think the question of like, which design system should I use, it really depends. I think each has their own unique personality and unique style to it. I think the code base is a lot different across design systems. So, some are built in React, some are built in vanilla. It's really just a personal preference. And I think what I would look for if I was brand new to design systems and unable to decide which one to use, like if I was just at a small company, I would probably look for a design system that just had a good, clean code base, and also a design system that provided user experience guidelines. So I think that's something I see missing in a lot of design systems is they do provide a great code base that's very strong and stable, but there's not a lot of usage patterns. There's not descriptions as to how do I use this component? Should I use a button? Should I use a link? And as people who don't have a design background who are using a design system, I think that's really important to make sure that people are using the right set of components to build out greater experiences, because ultimately that's going to make or break your UX, whether or not you're using the component library properly. The design system is, yes, it's a set of tools, it's a tooling system, but it's also a product in itself. So it's just like with anything, whether I choose to use Sketch or Illustrator, you really need to look at the breadth of the design system and make sure that there's a team maintaining it, continuing to scale and to build it out. And that's personally what I would look for if I was looking for a new design system to adopt.
All right, so I promise I'm going to ask you only 2 more questions and then wrap up. Well, the first question is, how do you personally, as the leader behind this whole sort of movement of carbon design system that's now responsible for effectively guiding the design of every single app inside IBM, which employs 450,000 people worldwide, you have responsibility of the world on your shoulders in many respects. So one could say, this is a huge social pressure that you are having to deal with. How do you as a designer cope with this pressure and that sort of expectation and the responsibility that you're inevitably carrying on your shoulders?
Yeah, so I don't do this alone. I definitely wasn't the main driving factor behind Carbon. There were many, many other people involved who kind of paved the way for me. And I rely so much on my team. So we have a developer lead who I work with to plan out our sprints, and I go to her all the time and ask for best practices on things. We have so many talented team members that I think it's just knowing that they have my back and I have their back is the strongest sense of community that I've felt ever working on a team before. And until you brought that up, like I kind of laughed because I don't feel a lot of pressure, to be honest. Like I just try and look at it lightly. Like we're building something that's so amazing and that's really helping people improve their workflow and hopefully bringing joy to their everyday life. And I don't think a lot of people get the opportunity to work on cool, quote unquote, cool products. And so I feel really lucky that I've been able to work on a design system and work on very micro parts of UX that I wasn't exposed to before. So yeah, to be honest, I don't feel a lot of pressure because I have such a strong team that I rely on for a lot of things, and I don't know all the answers, but maybe someone else does. And so I'm definitely not afraid to ask for help. When I first started out on Carbon, I reached out to so many people within the design systems community, just like, can I pick your brain about how you built the design system? And everyone was so responsive and very willing to have a conversation about that and their experiences. And so I have to credit those people as well who really helped us to kind of get an understanding for how to get started building a design system. And yeah, so it's a group effort for sure.
All right, and the final question then is, where is Carbon Design System heading in 2018, and maybe what can we expect to see from it? What are your kind of priorities, and how are you going to approach the increasing seemingly ability of UX design demands and changes and evolution going forward? I've been doing UX design 10 plus years, and I thought we were going to get to a point where everything is just like clicks and we're done with design, and more the time goes past, more it feels like millions of types of different challenges and use cases that we're having to cater to. So design system going in next year, and that's the last question.
Well, I can't tell you all our secrets. No, just kidding. But I think there's a lot of exciting things coming in the next year, and I think coming in the new year, it's always a good time to reflect and to come back feeling refreshed. And we've got a lot of different ideas in terms of tooling and plugins and just continuing to build out and scale the system. Right now, we're trying to make it so different teams can style the components how they'd like. So we'd really like to implement tokens, which Salesforce Lightning Design System has done an amazing job of doing. I think they pioneered that. So just kind of looking into how can we continue to scale it out to the point where many, many teams can be consuming Carbon, but really giving the components their own look and feel and style to them. So things like that, continuing to improve on our documentation. I like to go through and review just our UX patterns a lot and say, is this consistent across the board? We like to go back and review components and say, is this still working for people? So again, kind of like what I was talking about earlier, like the maintainability land, like that will continue throughout Carbon's existence, but also what can we still work on that's cool, and that what can we build that's like new and that people can get excited about as well.
All right. So thank you so much, Bethany, for joining this live stream. And I think you've given a very overview of Carbon Design System. I really enjoyed the fact that you've gone through the process of how you're doing this and what challenges there might exist, as well as actually what it individual product designers. So thank you so much for joining, and we can sort of answer questions, other questions that will arise afterwards. But I think this is a very nice overview of the design system, and I wish you best of successes in 2018. And looking forward to how this is going to evolve, and I'm going to continue using it myself for various kind of applications that we're designing. So, and Happy New Year.
Yes, thank you so much for having me. And I'd love to see what you build using Carbon.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.